Recently, I watched a newly released sci-fi movie called I Am Mother. The story takes place after a catastrophic event wipes out all humans on Earth. Before this event, a bunker was stocked with 63 human embryos. A robot, designed to repopulate the Earth, selects one of these embryos and raises it. The film's storyline isn't directly related to what I'm about to discuss. However, its opening scene sparked some intriguing questions in my mind. Babies born in complete isolation from the outside world. What kind of people would they become? If they grew up in such an environment, never encountering another human being, how would they communicate? What language would they speak? Of course, I'm not the first to ponder these questions. Throughout history, various experiments have been conducted where infants were deliberately kept isolated from all human communication. These are known as language deprivation experiments, because the subjects were prevented from hearing or learning any spoken or written language. The goal of these experiments was to uncover the origins of language and, on a deeper level, to understand the foundations of human nature. Naturally, isolating babies for such purposes is entirely unethical. This is why cultural historians like Roger Shattuck have referred to these as forbidden experiments instead. The first forbidden experiment. 600 BCE. Pharaoh Psamtik's study. The earliest known example of such an experiment is described by the historian Herodotus. Around 600 BCE, Pharaoh Psamtik of Egypt took 2 newborn babies from their families and placed them in the care of a shepherd. The shepherd was strictly forbidden from speaking to them. After some time, the babies began speaking their first word, because. This word didn't exist in the Egyptian language, but it did have meaning in the ancient Phrygian language, where it translated to bread. The Egyptians of that time took this as evidence that their language and origins traced back to Phrygia. 13th century, Emperor Frederick II experiment. Nearly 800 years later, a similar experiment was conducted by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century. Once again, infants were taken from their families and raised with minimal human interaction. Their basic needs were met, but no one ever spoke to them. Why? The question was, if humans are born with an innate language, what would it be? Would the children start speaking Hebrew? Perhaps Greek, Latin, or Arabic? These were the languages of sacred texts and ancient writings. Frederick II's ultimate goal was to discover what language Adam and Eve had spoken. The historian Salimbene Diadem provides accounts of this event, though he does not specify which language, if any, the children spoke. Instead, he focuses on the cruelty of the experiment itself. Naturally isolated children, feral children. In later centuries, there were no such intentional experiments, but some children still grew up in isolation under natural circumstances. These are known as feral children, children raised without human contact, often by animals. Since they had no exposure to human speech, they never developed language skills like ours. Take, for example, a girl named Oksana from Ukraine. She was raised by dogs, and as a result, learned to communicate using canine behavior and sounds. Over time, there have been documented cases of children raised by dogs, sheep, cows, goats, bears, and even ostriches. Naturally, these children adapted to the behaviors of the animals that raised them. Even after being reintroduced to human society, many never fully developed normal language skills. Isolation in another form, deafness. There is another type of natural language deprivation, congenital deafness. If a deaf child is born into a community where no one knows sign language, they often create their own system of communication. A fascinating case of this occurred in Nicaragua in the 1980s. A group of deaf children who had never been able to communicate with others were brought together for the first time. The goal was to teach them sign language so they could express themselves. But it didn't work. Why? Because they were no longer infants. Learning a new language at that stage was difficult for them. So, what happened instead? The children developed their own language. Using facial expressions and hand gestures, they created a complex and fully functional sign language from scratch. Linguists who later studied this phenomenon were astounded. They described the language as remarkably rich and sophisticated. How did languages originate? To this day, we still don't know exactly how the first languages emerged and evolved into the diverse languages we speak today. But we do know one thing. Language is our primary tool for sharing knowledge. Linguists believe that the strongest trigger for language development is the need for a group of people to share information. That's why we crave knowledge and feel the urge to pass it on. And to fulfill this need, humanity has created over 300 languages. At the beginning of this discussion, I mentioned, I am mother. In the film, a robot raises a human child by speaking to her like a mother would. Because of this, the child never feels the need to invent a new language. As Immanuel Kant once said, all language is a reflection of thought. To think is to have a conversation with oneself. And that is the highest form of language a human can create.